this is Jamie Mitchell, and we are back for another episode of the Libertarian Uncensored podcast, going over all the posts on the Libertarian Uncensored subreddit. Let's get right into it. So first we have, Trump says Biden's pardons are void and vacant because of AutoPen. The use of the AutoPen, a device that reproduces signatures and is ubiquitous in government and business, ordinarily uncontroversial. There is no power to undo a pardon in the Constitution or case law. And that's from nytimes.com, posted by Ninja Lover, and that's a cross post from the r/law subreddit. And, I personally don't really care for a lot of Biden's pardons, especially on people like Dr. Fauci and his son Hunter. But, ultimately, I do think, you should respect people's pardons when they do them. But, ultimately, as I say in a lot of episodes, it does come down to who has the force and power to do what. If Trump wants to say those pardons are all null and void and treat them like such, ultimately people will justify whatever they want to, I personally don't think, I don't know what you will call it, because, Trump will say a lot, but, I don't know if he'll actually act on it. It's like when Biden tweeted, oh, the Equal Rights Amendment's now law of the land. Just because you say something doesn't make it necessarily true. And you definitely see that a lot of politicians these days. Then we have Alien Enemies Act of 1789, posted by Narco Federation, and that's a YouTube video from Kyle Kalinske, I think, and that's fascism here, Trump, yada yada yada. And then they added an Israeli group sends the list of Trump administration for pro-Palestinian student protesters to deport. And personally, I don't really care for a lot of the pro-Palestinian protesters. I'm anti-Israel, but that doesn't necessarily make me pro-Palestine. But regardless, I do think, that they should have freedom of speech as long as they're being peaceful, and they shouldn't be deported. Because, I personally don't really care for the deportations at all. I think they go against individual autonomy. If people want to be deported, they should be able to, but deportations as they are currently are forced by the state, and I don't think that's very libertarian. I do think a lot of people who are getting deported, just like a lot of people who get the capital punishment or the death penalty or thrown in jail, a lot of people probably deserve it, but I think the libertarian perspective is you shouldn't be forcing your morality on others. And that's what the state always tries to do when it comes to stuff like deportations, prison sentences, or the death penalty. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Then we have the left's chicken tax is why we can't buy cheap foreign-made pickups, from posted by Spare Simeon, and that's a YouTube video from TFL Truck. What in the heck is a chicken tax? And yeah, they added once again on union protectionism on the left to deny consumer choice, and that's the real value of libertarianism. Consumer choice, both the left and right want to deny your right to choose how to spend your income. And I would agree with that. The freer the market, the freer the people is an old libertarian axiom, and I would agree with that. People should be able to do whatever they want with their own money and resources, and that's why we shouldn't be. But right now, we don't really have that in the U.S. We have a very controlled economy. The left has always been for union protections and all kinds of bullshit taxes and regulations. And the right used to be relatively more free market, but now they've gone down the protectionist route, so they're not as free market anymore either. So ultimately, I think, we gotta get rid of both of their authoritarian economic positions and embrace libertarian economic positions, the free market, free trade, and all that. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Then we have The Modern Georgism of Respected Economist, Part 1 free, Joseph Stiglitz, from progressandpoverty.substack.com, posted by Narco Federation. And they said, Your academic work led you to formulate what you called the Henry George theorem that demonstrated that this public spending, where this was efficient, generated additional rental values that surfaced in the land market. Other distinguished scholars, such as late Nobel Prize winner William Vickery, confirmed your findings. You also noted in one of your books, quoted by Anthony Atkinson, that the Henry George theorem was attractive both because it was the revenue raiser that did not support private incentives and because it's a single tax required to finance the public good. And that was from Anthony B. Atkinson and Joseph C. Stiglitz, Lectures on Public Economics, London, McGraw-Hill, 1980, page 225. And that was the quote that the original poster shared. And yeah, I personally, I'm kind of sympathetic toward Georgism. I don't really care for taxes at all, but I do think if there should be one tax, it should be a land value tax. that is very streamlined and efficient. I don't think that makes it. I still think it would be taxation. All forms of taxation are inherently fast, but I do think if we absolutely do have to have taxes, Georgism is probably the best rate to go if it's single land value tax. Then we have segregated facilities are no longer explicitly banned in federal contracts from NPR.org, posted by Patam 13. And yeah, ultimately I don't really care for segregation, but if people want to do it, I think that's an individual decision. I always bring up, Lester Maddox, I think if he didn't want to serve black people at his restaurant, he shouldn't have been forced to do so. I wouldn't care for that. I think you should serve anyone who comes in because, that's the free market. People should be able to interact with whoever they want. But ultimately, if they wanted to segregate, I think they should be able to. With that being said, I personally think not too many people are really segregating right now. And the biggest segregations right now is arguably a lot of people on the left, the woke segregationists who are like, oh, we need black only swim time, we need trans only swim time, etc., etc. Because they hate segregation until it's framed as supporting marginalized communities, and then they suddenly love it. So. Yeah, I'm personally very anti-segregation, but ultimately people will justify what they justify, and that's my thoughts there. And we have innocence disappeared in Trump's legal use of Alien Enemies Acts from the LatinTimes.com, posted by Patam 13. They added, here's the first of what I expect will be a number of people with no gang affiliations who have been tossed in the foreign prison camp by the Trump administration, completely bypassing due process. And yeah, I personally don't care for all the deportations and how they go against due process, but with that being said, as I said earlier, a lot of people are probably, the vast majority of people, not necessarily all of them, this guy might be an exception, but the vast majority of them are probably deserving of them, even if, they don't really, it's going against due process, because, they're mostly just thugs and gang members, murderers and rapists, but, since they're illegal immigrants, the left loves them because they love anyone who's considered a member of, a marginalized group, and, illegal immigrants are a marginalized group, so, that makes them inherently good. They don't, even if a lot of those people might be murderers, rapists, thugs, and gang members, they're in a marginalized group like illegal immigrants that Donald Trump says is bad, so they must mean they're good. That's why I really don't care for, aggressive, partisanship, especially when it comes to the left, because once they find you, if you're in an in-group category, they'll ignore all the bad traits about you as long as you don't question their official narratives. These guys can murder and rape, but if they said trans women aren't real women, suddenly the left would go, deport them. So it just kind of shows you that if people only care really what the narrative is rather than what the people are actually doing. Then we have Chief Justice Roberts rejects Trump's call for impeaching judge who ruled against his deportation plans, from Ground News, posted by Dr. Who 07. And yeah, so I personally I would agree with that. That there needs to be balance between the branches. I personally don't really care for deportations, as I said earlier. Even if a lot of people who gang them probably deserve them, but if Trump, he does, they're always acting like he's a king. But even if he does go against a few court orders here and there, he's still going to be held in check by the Supreme Court and the Congress. And yeah, that's my thoughts on that issue. A lot of people on the left might be saying, "Oh no, he's going to become an absolute monarch any day now. He's going to be worse than Hitler." But they've been saying that for almost a decade now, and it hasn't come to pass yet. So eventually, it's like the boy who cried wolf. When you say just Hitler every single day, people just don't care anymore. And that's my thoughts there. Then we have Minnesota state senator who introduced TDS bill arrested for soliciting underage prostitution, from Fox9.com, posted by CH4Lux, and that's cross-post from the News is a Stupid subreddit. And yeah, I don't think that's good, but it's very much that Reddit will find someone who goes against the narrative, and they'll say find something bad against them. But it supports narrative like last subreddit we went over. Last episode we went over a kidney transfer specialist support for taking our jobs, but that didn't note how she had pictures of Hezbollah and Hamas stuff on her phone, and even went to the leader of Hezbollah's funeral in Lebanon. So, it just goes to show you how when it's a member of the out group, they'll find every single bad thing they can about them. But when it's the in group, they'll ignore facts that go against the narrative. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Then we have The Modern Georgism of Respected Economists, Part 2 of 3, Harry Gunson Brown from Substack.com, posted by Narco Federation, and they said, his text, The Economics of Taxation, stood for a time as a benchmark for texts on the subject of tax incidents in his chosen profession. Brown's record was exemplary during 5 decades of teaching at Yale, Missouri, the New School of Social Research, Mississippi, and Franklin and Marshall. He wrote more than 100 articles and 10 books. He was said to be for many years the dominant influence being the Missouri School of Business and Public Administration. His dedication to teaching has been praised by his students, many of whom were to become prominent in economics and related areas. And yeah, we already talked about the first part of this with Georgia in the first part of this, but yeah, that guy sounds cool, I guess. I personally, as I said earlier, I don't really care for any form of taxation, but if we do absolutely have to have one, I do think the land value tax of Georgia is probably the best one. Then we have Doge wasting taxpayers' dollars on court cases for their flagrant unconstitutional actions from NewRepublic.com by C.H. Fort Locks, and yeah, I don't think that's very good, but ultimately, if I do like a lot of what Doge is, the direction Doge wants to send the U.S. government, but I think it's a lot of it's performative, and it's not really getting too much done. But ultimately, if they want to throw money away on whatever they want to, it's fine. But when you market yourself as saving money and reducing waste, when you throw money away on frivolous lawsuits, that kind of strikes me as hypocritical, and that's my thoughts on that issue. Then we have When They Call You Unconstitutional from FunCal321, and that's YouTube video from John Talks 2. And yeah, that seems to be like I agree that what a lot of Trump's doing is it could be considered unconstitutional, but a lot of what the progressives and Democrats were doing for years has been unconstitutional. I would say the Constitution, ever since ever since the ink was dried, people have done constantly unconstitutional things. And that just goes to show you the Constitution really doesn't matter. What matters is how people are what people are willing to justify, and people are willing to violate the Constitution pretty much the second after the ink was dried. Not even like I think even less than a century after it was drafted, you already had stuff like Abraham Lincoln suspending habeas corpus during the Civil War, and Andrew Jackson saying the Supreme Court ruled this way, but let them enforce that decision, and then deporting all the Indians down the Trail of Tears. So it just goes to show you how all the presidents are probably unconstitutional, but to some extent, but the people, the progressives only seem to care that the orange man doesn't care for it. They don't really care about any of but Joe Biden or Barack Obama's unconstitutional orders, but then when Donald Trump, they suddenly are these constitutional scholars, and that just goes to show you, that they aren't principled. They just will follow whatever the narrative is. Then we have Keep Crying Leon. You asked for every bit of this, and that's from Ragnarok KXD, and that's crosspost from the There Was an Attempt subreddit. It's clip from Elon Musk on Fox News to not own up to any of his terrible things he's been doing to damage the Tesla brand. And that's Elon speaking on Fox News about how, the left says it's the party of empathy and kindness, but, they're burning down Teslas and Tesla dealerships because, the narrative says to. And I would agree with that, you gotta wonder, these people say, oh, I'm an empath, and then they go burn down a protest and calls anyone who burn down a Tesla, and then call anyone who disagrees with them a Nazi, and that just goes to show you, they might say they're an empath, but they're really just a bunch of phonies and bullies, and that's why, you can't trust those guys. It's the same with a lot of people on the right. They can be phonies and bullies too. But the left is really the one who's controlling the narrative on Reddit. So that's why I particularly don't care for them. And you gotta wonder where are all these protests coming from? They say they're grassroots, like that 50-51 the protest. But I definitely won't be surprised if someone like George Soros or Pierre Omidyar was funding them. And yeah, that's definitely my thoughts there. And it just goes to show you how the left will say, oh, I'm a progressive, but then they'll burn down electric cars even after they pushed EVs for years, because Elon Musk will join the political out group instead of the political in group. Then we have Nazi doesn't know why he's being hated from Ragnarok KXG, and that's a crosspost from the real Twitter account subreddit. He is so stupid and annoying, and that's a tweet from Elon Musk. My companies make great products that people love, and I've never physically hurt anyone, so why the hate and violence against me? Because I'm a deadly threat to the woke mind parasite and the humans it controls. And I would agree with that. You know, if you question the official narrative at all, the woke moralist will come after you, and Elon's a good example of that. And yeah, so that's my thoughts on that issue. And then we have U.S. officials tracking down on people trying to bring valuable eggs across the border. Egg interceptions up to 116% so far this year, while users of fentanyl now down 32% from CBC.ca, listed by CH4Locks. And yeah, I personally think we need free trade even across the border. I personally don't think, that's a lot of stuff, is going across the border, might be useful like eggs, but you do have the argument that what about fentanyl? And ultimately, I think if people do want to traffic drugs or fentanyl, I think they should be able to. I don't think fentanyl is good for you. I personally would never do it, but ultimately people will justify what they justify, regardless of the system in place or the borders in place. And that's my thoughts on that issue. And I think we're gonna wrap it up there. I'll see you guys in the next episode. Bye.